And that illustrious old man who, upon the brink of the grave, performed so admirable an act of patriotism was scoffed at. They were provoked at his boldness. If Jean-Jacques, Voltaire, and Montesquieu had accompanied him, they would not have met with better success. What would have been the science of those men compared with the sciences of the day? That intolerance of opinion has too often overwhelmed in our assemblies the voice of our best citizens, and perhaps our giant of the tribune, our Mirabeau himself, died in time for his glory. The names of Raynal and Mirabeau bring me back to Napoleon. Napoleon, in one of those congés which he went to pass at Ajaccio, it was, I believe, 1790, had composed a history of the revolutions of Corsica, of which I wrote 2 copies, and of which I much regret the loss. One of these manuscripts was addressed to him, to the Abbé Raynal, whom my brother had known on his passage to Marseille. Raynal found that work so extremely remarkable that he decided upon communicating it to Mirabeau, who, on returning the manuscript, wrote to Raynal that little history appeared to him to announce a genius of the first order. The reply of Raynal accorded with the opinion of the great orator, and Napoleon was enchanted. I have made a great many researches in vain to find these manuscripts. They were perhaps destroyed in the burning of our house by the troops of Paoli. These literary communications had strengthened the admiration of Napoleon for those 2 great men of genius. The death of Mirabeau afflicted him very sensibly. The address of Raynal to the Constituent Assembly was not without influence upon us. And if Paoli had confined himself to declaring for the party in France favorable to the ideas of political equilibrium, we should have seconded him with all our efforts. The course of events had decided it otherwise, and we could but felicitate ourselves. Napoleon had arrived at the theater of that great war for which he felt himself born, and from his field of victory it sufficed for him to send some officers in arms to tear Corsica from the English, and from renown of Napoleon had effaced the former renown of an ancient chief. Among the officers sent into Corsica was the brave Costa di Basilica, the defender of our family in the days of adversity. I had just arrived at Genoa in time to see the departure of our islanders and to embrace Costa, for whom I had always from my childhood a particular friendship. Had it not been for the impatience which I felt to behold in the midst of his triumphs my brother, already master of Lombardy, I should have set out for Ajaccio. In the course of a few days we learned that the whole island had revolted, and that Paoli in despair had taken refuge in London, where he received till his last hour that respect which was his due. They even wished to perpetuate that respect by erecting to his memory a tomb in Westminster Abbey. It is also in an English tomb that Napoleon reposes. But what a tomb! What a vengeance! Oh, eternal shame to freemen who become the instruments of despotic kings! I fear not, noble British nation, although amid ye, to let this fraternal cry escape me. I have traveled in your provinces, and in your palaces, in your houses, and in your cottages. I have often been affected with the sight of the image of Napoleon, and I have exclaimed 100 times in beholding it, here is what attests to the sentiment of reparation in a nation that knows how to appreciate a hero. Those who confined and suffered the noble victim to die upon the rock of St. Helena, did they show themselves worthy of the great people whom they governed? I had obtained permission to quit the north to go to Milan, where our army had made its entry. Napoleon was no longer at Milan. The revolt of Pavia had just broken out, and it was said that the general was gone to the banks of the Adige to chastise the guilty city. I hastened to Pavia. Upon the road my eyes were struck with the distant reflection of a vast fire. It was the village of Renasco, delivered up to the flames to expiate the assassination of several of our straggling soldiers. I traversed the burning ruins. Pavia presented me in a few moments after with a spectacle even more deplorable. That great city had been delivered up to pillage in the morning. The traces of blood had not been washed away. The bodies of the peasants who had refused to surrender were not carried away. People were occupied with those funeral rites within the gate by which I entered. The streets and places were transformed into a perfect fair, where the conquerors were selling to hideous speculators the spoils of the vanquished. What miseries, even in the most just of wars, and the most necessary victories. I could only remain with my brother half a day. He was to return in the evening upon his favorite line of the Adige. He gave me his instructions, and I departed for Corsica. After some days of a stormy voyage, I found myself in my beloved native town, where I thought only of obtaining the suffrages of my fellow citizens for the epoch when I should become eligible. The last 6 months of the year and the following, 96 and 97, were filled with the exploits of Napoleon and the army of Italy from Montenotte to Campo Formio. It was a continuation of prodigies. When we consider together, the imagination is struck with the multitude of the battles, the fecundity of the conceptions, and the immensity of the results. Entering into Italy with 30 and a few thousand men, Bonaparte separated in the first place the Piedmontese from the Austrians at Montenotte and at Malissimo, succeeds in destroying the first at Mondovi, then hastens after the second, passes the Po before them at Plaisance, the Adda at Lodi, takes possession of Lombardy, stops for a moment, soon resumes his march, finds the Austrians reinforced upon the Mincio, and completes their destruction at the Battle of Borgato. There he sees, as with a coup d'oeil, the plan of his future operations. It is upon the Adige that he must establish himself to face the Austrians. As for the princes that were in his rear, he contents himself by holding them in check with negotiations and menaces. A second army is sent against him under Wurmser. He could only defeat it by rapidly concentrating his own forces and striking alternately each of those isolated masses. As a resolute man, he sacrifices the blockade of Mantua, overwhelms Wurmser at Lonato, at Castiglione, and drives him again into the Tyrol. Wurmser is reinforced at Boglio. Bonaparte was beforehand with him in the Tyrol, remounts the Adige, overturns all before him at Rovereto, throws himself across the valley of the Brenta, cuts up Wurmser, who thought of cutting him off, overthrows him at Bassano, and shuts him up in Mantua. This is the second Austrian army destroyed after being reinforced.